Paris, a king's square became his execution site. 18th century Paris, shaped by wars and the French Revolution, especially the French Revolution, a capital city, but the court lived far away in Versailles. Yet ideas, money, and political power all centered here, on these streets, where a square built to honor a king became the site of his execution. Today, we explore that whole century, how the city lived, what it built, what it thought, and why Paris became the epicenter of a historic shift. This is Paris in the 18th century. At the start of the century, Paris was already huge for Europe. Estimates say around 500,000 people at the beginning, growing to 650,000 by 1789. That made it one of Europe's biggest cities, and also vulnerable. Feeding, heating, employing, and keeping order was a constant struggle. In 1715, Louis XIV died. France had just come off decades of war, including the huge Spanish Succession War. The country was in debt, and Paris felt it. Meanwhile, daily life in Paris kept going, like a giant machine. The city thrived on trades: wood, leather, metal, printing, fashion. The Seine riverbanks buzzed with trade, the markets were stocked, and the contrast was stark. Grand palaces and private homes on one side, cramped courtyards, crowded housing, and narrow streets on the other. As the decades passed, Paris began to change its look. The rulers wanted a city that impressed, that looked modern, orderly, worthy of France. In 1748, a statue of Louis XV on horseback was commissioned, sparking an urban project that created one of the world's most famous spots. Construction started in 1757 and finished in 1772. Back then it was Place Louis XV, today it's Place de la Concorde. But while squares were built, something harder to control was also rising: the intellectual climate. In 1751, the first volume of the encyclopedia was published. Its aim was to collect and organize knowledge, based on reason and science, not religion as the main authority. It explained philosophy, science, arts, trades, and techniques, with 17 volumes of text and many illustrated plates, for defending free thought and criticizing dogma and privilege. It faced censorship and conflict with religious and state authorities, yet it profoundly influenced European culture. In Paris, a dangerous idea for any rigid system became normal: that knowledge can be organized, discussed, questioned, and so can authority. Paris now had a clear center for agitation: the Palais Royal. Here pamphlets, newspapers, and speeches circulated, igniting the city, and decisions were sometimes made on the street before in the palace. The 18th century was also a series of conflicts draining the country. France went to war and Paris felt it. The War of the Austrian Succession in 1740, and especially the 7 Years' War in 1756. This war spanned continents, ending with colonial losses and a major blow to finances. Then came the most expensive bill. France joined the war to support American independence in 1778 against Great Britain. The cost finally strained the system to its limit, and as if the city itself wanted to mark its entry into a new era. In 1757, the foundations were laid for a building that embodied the century's ambition. Construction began on the Pantheon, finished in 1790. Originally a church, St. Genevieve, the Revolution reinterpreted it. So far, Paris seemed to be progressing, bigger, grander. Pantheon's construction wrapped up in 1790. Originally the Church of St. Genevieve, more intellectual. But the 18th century also had a harsh side. The city lived on the edge, and the clearest sign came when bread sparked open conflict. In April and May 1775, riots broke out, known as the Flour War, protests and riots over the rising price of grain, and thus bread. These occurred late in Louis XV's reign and early in Louis XVI's. Paris got used to a strange mix: on one hand progress, culture, debate; on the other, flour protests and riots over price hikes. Bread prices are wild during Louis XV and XV's reign. Paris is a paradox: culture and debate mixed with something else: economic anxiety and distrust. Between 1784 and 1791, the Wall of the Fermier Generaux was built, not to defend Paris from armies, but to collect taxes on incoming goods. In other words, the state squeezed harder just as the city was at its limit. Still, the system tried to hold on until there was no other way. By the late 1780s, tax reforms failed, and the debt could no longer be hidden. King Louis XVI did something unseen for generations. He called a Grand National Assembly to ask for more taxes, because the state could no longer pay its debts. This assembly brought together the church, nobility, and representatives of the common people. But the common people's representatives, the majority, said, "We sustain the country, we decide." and they declared themselves the National Assembly. Basically, we're changing the rules. They took the tennis court oath, vowing not to stop until a new form of government was written down. Then came July 14, 1789. Paris entered world history with the storming of the Bastille. What it was and what it represented mattered. A fortress prison, symbolizing royal power. There were few prisoners inside at that moment, but the Bastille was an emblem. The city sent a message to the monarchy. Control was no longer solely from the palace. A few weeks later, a document arrived that defined the end of the 18th European century. On August 26, 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted. Then came a scene that felt like a movie, but it was history. On October 5–6, 1789, the Women's March on Versailles ended with the royal family's move to Paris. Power was now established in the Tuileries Palace. From then on, the political center was within the capital, directly pressured by the city. For Paris, this meant politics was no longer a distant rumor. It was streets away. In 1791, the relationship between Paris and the monarchy broke further with an event that changed public perception. On the night of June 20–21, the royal family attempted to flee Paris in the flight to Varennes, but they were caught and returned. From then on, the discussion wasn't just about reform. Paris is closer than you think. In 1791, tensions between Paris and the monarchy exploded. June 20th -21 stoned the royal family. It was about whether the monarchy could even exist. August 10, 1792 was the point of no return. The insurrection that overthrew the monarchy occurred. The Tuileries Palace was stormed, the king lost effective power, and the royal family was imprisoned. Paris was no longer just pressuring, it was deciding. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed in Paris in the Place de la Révolution, the same square that started the century as Place Louis XV. Royal reform debate. Is monarchy on its way out? August 10, 1792. No turning back. The monarchy falls after a major uprising. Tuileries Palace stormed. King loses real power. Royal family. Paris isn't just pushing anymore. It's deciding. Louis XVI executed January 21, 1793. During 1793 and 1794, Paris experienced the period of revolutionary government and radicalization, until another decisive turn. On July 27, 1794, the coup of 9 Thermidor happened, Robespierre fell, and the Thermidorian reaction began, marking the end of terror as dominant policy. In 1791, the Pont de la Concorde was finished, with some stone from the demolished Bastille. It was almost a physical message. You cross the Seine stepping on the fortress. Paris, 1793–1794, the Reign of Terror. Radicalization escalates, then a major twist hits on July 27, 1794, the 9 Thermidor coup. Robespierre falls. The Thermidorian reaction begins, ending the Reign of Terror. Dominant policy. In 1791, the Pont de la Concorde was finished, partly with stone from that had represented royal power. In 1793, the Louvre. In the midst of the revolution, the palace became a public museum. On August 10th, the museum's Central des Arts opened. Palace turned public museum. Sartre's Central Museum opens August 10th. It's a massive cultural shift. Art is no longer just for the elite. It's now national heritage. In October 1795, the Directory takes over in Paris. They tried stabilizing the country with a new system, but in 1799 the Brumaire coup overthrows the Directory, creating the consulate and boosting Napoleon. Paris exits the 18th century, leaving one world behind and entering a new one. I'm Max. Thanks for time traveling with me.